Chapter 25. The Good in Criminals. The criminal is confronted in court with an indictment charging him with a violation of the law. He is a human being, like all others, neither perfect nor entirely worthless. He has some tendencies and inclinations which the world calls good, for lack of a better term, and some that it calls bad, for the same reason. In this he is like the jury and the judge. The strength of the different tendencies is not the same in any two machines. The judge and jury are interested in determining whether he is good or bad, that is, better or worse than they themselves. In theory, he is tried on the charges contained in the indictment. In most cases, by a constant stretching of the rules of evidence, his whole life may be involved. That is, proof may be offered of any act of delinquency that constituted a violation of the law, if in any way similar or in any way connected with the one charged in the indictment. He cannot meet these charges by proving the acts of kindness and charity and real worth that are rarely absent in any life. The proceedings show how bad he is, not how good. He may be able to call witnesses to show that up to the time of the bringing of the indictment his reputation for honesty was good, but he cannot show that he supported his grandmother, or helped his aunt, or educated his younger brother, or gave his money to the poor. All the good is irrelevant to the issue. This does not prove that he did not commit the act. It might clearly prove whether on the whole he should go to jail. Through this process he feels that the law and proceedings are unfair, and that he is condemned when in fact he is as good as those who judge him. Neither can he show the circumstances that hedged in his way, nor the equipment with which he entered life. Under the legal theory that he is the captain of his soul, these are not material to the issue. Neither can he show the direct motive that caused the conduct. It may have been a motive that was ideal, but the question involved is, did he violate the law? He is convicted and sent to prison. As a rule, he will sometime be turned back into the world. He needs careful treatment, involving instruction, and an appeal to that part of his nature which may awaken sympathies and produce emotions which will make him more of a social being on his return to the world. In the loose language of the world, it is necessary for him not only to learn how to curb the evil, but how to increase the good. His imagination should be cultivated and enlarged. The responses to better sentiment should be strengthened. This can be furthered only by skilled teachers, who are moved by the desire to help him. The process should be similar to a hospital treatment. Instead of this, he is usually surrounded by men of little intelligence or education, men who have no fitness for the task. He is governed by strict rules, all of them subjecting him to severe penalties when violated. Every action in the prison reminds him of his status. With the exception of a few strong men who need suffering for their development, it can have but one result. He must come out from prison poorer material than when he went in. There are only two reflections that can keep him out of trouble in the future: the remembrance of the past, and the fear that a similar experience might come to him again. When it is remembered that the greatest enemy to happiness and life is fear, when we realize that the constant battle of the primitive man was with the fear that peoples the unknown with enemies and dangers, when we remember that in some way fear of poverty, of disease, of disaster, of loss of friends and life is the ever-present enemy of us all, it is evident that nothing but harm can come from the lessons of fear that are drilled into the victim in prison. Life furnishes countless ways to be kind and helpful and social. It furnishes infinite ways to be cruel, hard, and antisocial. Most of these antisocial ways are not condemned by the law. Whether the life is helpful and kindly, or hard and selfish, can never depend upon the response of an organism to fear, but upon the response of an organism to the kindlier and more humane and sympathetic sentiments that to some extent at least inhere in the constitution of man. It is a common thing for prisoners, even during the longest term, to be more solicitous about mother, child, wife, brother, or friend than about themselves. It is common for them to deny themselves privileges, presents, or favours to help other inmates. The consideration and kindness shown by unfortunates to each other are surprising to those who have no experience with this class of men. Often, to find real sympathy, you must go to those who know what misery means. Pride and coldness are usually due to lack of understanding, and life alone can bring understanding. Every intelligent man engaged in efforts to improve and help either criminals or children, or any others, knows the need of an appeal to what passes as the better nature. Help does not come so much from directly inhibiting the bad as by extending the area of the higher emotions. To pull up weeds in a garden without planting something in their place is a foolish task. The human being is like the garden. Something must grow in the soil. If weeds are pulled up and nothing planted, nature will grow more weeds. Some feelings and emotions always possess every person. The best that is incident to the machine should be found, and this be cultivated and extended until it dominates the man. Courts and prisons have no machinery to cultivate the best in their victims. They are always looking for the worst, aiding and promoting it, until the prisoner is driven to hopelessness and despair. Chapter 26. The Defective and Insane. It is almost hopeless to bring any system or order out of the chaos that prevails in the discussion of the insane, the defective, the moron, and the feeble-minded. The world has so long believed that man is a specially created animal, and that he does wrong from free choice, that much more time and investigation are necessary before sane and scientific theories can be formulated on this subject. It has been a great many years since any semi-intelligent man believed that all sorts of physical abnormalities were due to one cause, and could be cured by one method, and yet the prevailing opinion now, even among the fairly educated, is that all sorts of abnormal conduct are due to one cause, perversity and wickedness, and should be treated with only one prescription, punishment. Scientific men indeed have long known that there were causes for the abnormality of conduct, and that there were various more or less satisfactory remedies for many cases. Still, the time that scientists have worked on the problem is short, and the data imperfect, and many years of patient study will be needed before there can be worked out the broad theories of responsibility for and treatment of crime, which will replace the long accepted doctrines of original sin and the expulsion of devils from the wicked by cruelty and punishment. By far the largest part of the population of prisons is made up of the insane, feeble-minded, morons, defectives, or victims of diseases that seriously influence conduct. This is especially shown by the increased percentage of the clearly defective that are repeaters over those in prison for their first offense. There is no lack of statistics as to the various groups of defectives, but these figures cannot be reconciled. No two authorities agree as to percentages. The classifications are more or less uncertain. The dividing lines between the different groups are vague, one class easily fading into another. The investigations have largely been made by those not trained for the work, and above all the conclusions as to treatment are at variance, doubtful, and necessarily not yet satisfactory. That the clearly insane and the plainly feeble-minded should not be punished would doubtless be admitted by all who speak in public or write for others to read. Many persons speaking in private, acting on juries and connected with the machinery of justice, say that these should be punished like the rest. Still, for a starting point, it may be assumed that most men would agree that these classes should be restrained rather than punished. The chief difficulty is that between the most violently insane and the least emotional man are infinite numbers of gradations blending so closely that no one can mathematically or scientifically classify all the various individual units. While there are cases of insanity that can be clearly traced to injury or disease, the degree of sanity in most cases is still impossible to determine. Most insane people are sane on some things, generally on most things, and are sane a part or most of the time. The periods of sanity and insanity can be distinguished only by conduct. How far any specific insanity may impair the brain and affect the inhibitions is impossible to foretell. When it comes to the defective, the problem is still more difficult. No two persons have the same degree of intelligence. Some are clearly lacking in mentality, others are manifestly intelligent. The great mass range all along between these extremes. Various arbitrary rules have been laid down to aid in classifying different grades of defectives. Generally, the feeble-minded can be sorted out. The defectives are supposed, if young, to be 2 years or more below the normal scholar in development; if older, 3 or more below. Their standing is fixed by asking certain test questions. Furthermore, a list of questions has been commonly used for an intelligence test. These queries have nothing to do with the school work of the child, but are supposed to reveal only his native intelligence. No doubt, in a broad way, such tests throw considerable light on the mentality of those who submit to the examination. Ordinary experience, however, shows that they cannot be fully relied on. Some children develop very slowly, others very rapidly. Some are much quicker, others slower in their perceptions and responses. No two children or grown-ups have the same turn of mind. One may be very bright in business affairs and very dull in books. One may be clever in arithmetic and hopeless in grammar. One may have marked mechanical ability and no taste for school. These tests are only valuable if given by well-qualified examiners, and the method is so new that few have had the chance to thoroughly prepare for the work. For the most part, the tests are given by people who are wholly unfit for so important a task. Quite aside from all this, it is not certain that intelligent people are necessarily safer to the community than stupid ones. There is always a tendency for the stupid to stick to the beaten path. Intelligence generally means individuality and divergence. On the other hand, the stupid and subnormal are moved much more directly by instincts and emotions. Their lack of imagination, poor perceptions, and want of reasoning or comparing power make their self-control weak. In sudden stress or an unusual situation, they are easily swept away and respond directly to instinct and feeling. In short, the urge of the primitive, through the long history of the race, cannot be modified sufficiently by the new structure that civilization has built around more intelligent people. The various distinctions between the feeble-minded and the normal must not be taken with too much confidence. As the motives that govern man are understood, it is easy to see that intelligence is a strong factor in regulating behavior. When it is seen also that at least the larger part of the inmates of prisons are subnormal, and at the same time without property or education, it is evident that all these handicaps are dominating causes of conduct. This position is made still more certain by the further evidence that nearly all of the repeaters in prison are of this type. Most states already make some allowances in their criminal codes for the defective and the insane. This is really an acknowledgment that the activity of the human machine is governed by its make and environment. The history of the treatment of the insane serves to show the uncertainty of all man's theories as to punishment and responsibility. Doubtless, at a very early age in the history of man, it was discovered that there were people who acted so abnormally that they could not be classified with the great mass. Such persons were supposed to be possessed of devils or demons, and various incantations and practices were used to drive the devils out. Failing this, they were put in prison, loaded with chains, or put to death because of their danger to the community. In other communities, however, insane persons were thought to be possessed of special gifts. God had come nearer to them than to common mortals, and they were seers or prophets, endowed with a portion of the divine power. Either view of the problem is explainable by the lack of scientific or exact knowledge that marks early societies. Still, these societies relied on punishments just as much as our present lawmakers and enforcers, possibly more, because presumably less enlightened. Further investigations and experiences with the insane have convinced even the most casual observer that they function somewhat differently from other people. There is not the same certainty between stimulus and response. What they will do and how they will act under given conditions cannot be foretold with anything approaching the exactness that is possible with the normal. The origin of the insanity in many cases is clearly traceable, sometimes to lesions, sometimes to illness, sometimes to the mode of life. Perhaps more is due to heredity than to any other cause. At any rate, in theory, the civilized world has long since ceased to hold the insane criminally responsible for their acts. This applies only to the clearly insane. The borderline is impossible to find, and many cases are so difficult to classify that there is often a doubt as to where the given patient belongs. In times when the crowd is mad with the mob psychology of hatred, people are impatient of insanity and do not care whether the accused was sane or not at the time of the commission of the act. Many insane are put to death or sentenced to long terms of punishments. Jails and other penal institutions are constantly sorting their inmates and finding many who were clearly insane at the time their sentences began. Society is beginning to find out that even where there is no marked insanity, many are so near idiocy that they cannot fairly be held responsible for their acts. The line here is just as vague and uncertain as with the insane. Thus far, society has not provided adequate protection for the public against this class. Neither has it properly cared for these unfortunates. It has simply excused their conduct, except in cases where some act is so shocking that it arouses special hatred, and then it freely declares that it makes no difference whether the accused is a defective or not. He is of no value to the world and should die. Many of this class are put to death. I am inclined to think that most of those executed are either insane or serious defectives, and those who say that such people are of no value are probably right. It is perhaps equally true that few, if any, are of value, for when value is considered, we are met with the question, value to whom or for what? All you can say of anyone is that he wishes to live and has the same inherent instincts and emotions toward life as are common to all other men. Even the legal tests as to insanity and feeble-mindedness are neither logical nor humane. Often the definition is given by courts that if one is able to distinguish between right and wrong, he is sane within the meaning of the law. This definition of insanity is utterly unscientific. If the insane, or the defective above an idiot, is questioned specifically whether certain distinct things are right or wrong, he can generally give the conventional classification. Often he can tell much better than the intelligent man, for he has been arbitrarily taught the things that are right and wrong, and has not the originality or ability to inquire whether the classification is right, or how far circumstances and conditions determine right and wrong. Conduct is ruled by emotion, and actions depend not upon whether one has learned to classify certain conduct as right or wrong, but whether from education, life, or otherwise, the thought of a certain act produces a quick and involuntary reaction against doing it. No one believes or feels that it is always really wrong to violate some statutes, and most men indulge in many practices that are wrong and repulsive, but not forbidden by the criminal code. Furthermore, the insane and subnormal are influenced by punishment and fear. Even the animal responds to both. It is possible that in many instances those who are insane and subnormal are influenced by fear more than the intelligent and normal. The most that can be said is that they have not the same power of resistance that is given stronger men. This means only that they have not stored up the experiences of life so well, that their nervous system has not so well conveyed impressions, or that their power of comparison is less. This, in turn, means that it will take greater stress or harder environment to overcome the inhibitions of the sane than the insane. The treatment of the insane and the defective is an acknowledgment that all conduct comes from a direct response of the machine to certain stimuli, and the machine can act only in a way consistent with its mechanism. In other cases, the courts often recognize the strength of hereditary defects in nullifying environment with its strict ideas of right and wrong. The kleptomaniac is generally recognized as being a well-defined class of the insane. Most of the shoplifters are women. This is especially a female crime. It is useless to explain why. It is not a daring crime. It is secretive in its nature. It requires more stealth than courage. It especially appeals to women on account of their taste for the finery exhibited at stores. The kleptomaniac, however, is generally a rich or influential woman. She steals something she does not need, and she is therefore held to be a kleptomaniac and not responsible. The poor woman who steals something she actually needs is not a kleptomaniac. I have no doubt that the rich woman who could not resist shoplifting is a kleptomaniac. I have just as little doubt that the poor woman with an imperfect make found her environment such that she was forced to act as she did. If a rich woman is irresponsible and cannot resist when she steals something she does not need, I can see no reason why a poor woman is not likewise irresponsible when she takes something that she needs or must have. The kleptomaniac finds herself in a position where her emotions and her feelings are too strong for her judgment and inhibitions. Everyone who acts must act from similar causes or inducements. There is no special providence in the realm of mind. There is no room for chance in any natural phenomenon. Possibly the public will understand sometime, and lawmakers and law enforcers will place crime and punishment on a scientific basis. Chapter 27. Social Control. Organizations and cults are forever coining new expressions that sound pat, and for this reason seem true. As a rule, these terms and phrases are put in the shape of general statements that may or may not mean something, but their pat sound is used to justify all sorts of excesses and violations of individual rights. The term social control is met everywhere now. It may imply much or little, according to the construction of the users. It is meant, at least, to imply that somewhere is lodged a power to bring under control or supervision the refractory or evil elements of society for the well-being of the whole. As a rule, under this phrase anything is justified which seems in some way fit for the community as a whole. The fact that the restraint interferes with personal liberty seems to have no bearing on the matter. Social control necessarily means that the majority of the members of a social unit shall limit the freedom of action of the individual to conform to its view. Of course, the majority has the right, because it has the power. In the discussion of political or philosophical questions, right means little more or less than power. A right must be based upon some custom or habit with some power to enforce it, or it cannot be claimed. It can never be enjoyed without the power to obtain it. The relation of society to the individual has been one long conflict. This is necessarily true because every human organism has instincts, feelings, and desires, and is naturally impatient at any limitations placed upon it, unless self-imposed. On the other hand, organized society functions to preserve itself, and if the activities of the individual are hostile to this preservation, the individual must give way. Theorists of various schools are forever propounding social ideas, with the positive assurance that, if followed, they would work automatically and heal all social ills. But it must be evident that neither from history nor philosophy can any such theory be proved. Between the extreme anarchistic view that each person should be free of control by law, and the extreme socialistic view of an extension of state organization until all property and all industrial activity shall be administered by the state and collectively owned, social life in its relation to the individual is always shifting. No one can find the proper line, and if there were a line, it would forever change. On the one hand, the power of the strongest element in social organization is always seeking to enlarge the province of the state. On the other hand, the individual unit following the natural instincts for its development is reaching out for more freedom and life. When the theorists in each camp manage to push so hard that both can no longer be maintained, the old organization of society breaks up into new units, immediately to reform in some new way. This struggle of contending forces is a prolific and unavoidable source of crime. When organized society goes too far, the individual units rebel and clash with law. When the units swing too far away from the social organization and defy the power of the state, almost automatically some sort of a new organization becomes the state. Whether this new one discards all old forms and laws and acts without the written law is of no concern. It at least acts and sets limits to the individual life. If it were possible for all legislative bodies to meet and repeal all laws, the state would still remain. The people would live and automatically form themselves into a certain order and protect that order either by written law or vigilance committees. At least the people would act together. The majority generally has some religious creed, and to it this is all important. This creed is made up of observances such as holy days, the support of the prevailing religion, the condemnation of witchcraft and magic, and the like. These and other doctrines often have been enforced upon those who have no faith in the regulations. The enforcement of such laws in the past has been by the most drastic penalties, and has brought extreme suffering upon the world. No religious organization has ever seemed willing to confine its activities to propaganda, teaching, and moral suasion. Those methods are too slow, and the evils and consequences of disbelief are too great. Laws of this drastic character are still part of the penal codes of various states and nations, and well-organized bodies are always strenuously seeking to extend the application of such laws and reenact at least a portion of the religious code that has been outgrown. Individuals have likewise found, or at least believed, that certain personal habits were best for them, for instance, abstaining from alcohol and tobacco in all forms. Not content with propaganda, they have sought to force their views upon others, many of whom deeply resent their interference. It is not enough that certain things shall be best for the health and physical welfare of a community. This does not justify the wise lawgiver in making them a part of the penal code. If so, the code would be very long. No doubt coffee and tea and perhaps meat are injurious to health. Most likely the strength of the community would be conserved if regular sleeping hours were kept, and if great modifications or changes were made in dress. But this does not justify criminal statutes. The code must take notice of something more than the general welfare. Unless the end sought to be attained is very direct and plain, and the evil great, so that a large majority believes in the law, it should be left to education and to other voluntary social forces. A large part of the community has always attributed many criminal acts to intoxicating drinks. I am convinced that with such crimes as murder, burglary, robbery, forgery, and the like, alcohol has had little to do. Petty things like disorderly conduct are often caused by intoxicating liquor, and these land a great many temporarily in jail, but these acts are really not criminal. Men have been temporarily locked up for over-drinking. If over-eating had been treated the same as over-drinking, the jails would often be filled with gluttons. As to health, probably the glutton takes the greater chance. A very large percentage of deaths would have been materially delayed except for excessive eating. The statements ascribing crime to intoxicating drinks have generally been made by those who are obsessed with a hatred of alcohol. As a rule, if one lands in prison and has not been a total abstainer, his downfall is charged to rum. Statistics have been gathered in prison, often by chaplains, who in the main are prohibitionists and interested in sustaining an opinion. The facts are mainly furnished by inmates of prisons, a poor source from which to gather facts and draw deductions, especially as to the cause of crime. Prisoners are interested in only one thing, and that is getting out. They understand perfectly well what kind of statistics the chaplain wants, and these are given. It is the nature and part of the protective instinct of everyone to find some excuse for his acts. Alcohol has always furnished this excuse. It is a good alibi. It is readily believed, always awakens sympathy, and at once turns the wrath of a provincial community from the inmate of the prison to the saloon keeper. Even if prisoners were unlike others and wished to tell the truth about themselves, they have not the art and understanding to give the causes of their plight. No man, however intelligent, can do this, least of all one of inferior brain power, little education, and not trained in dealing with facts. The prison inmate, like everyone else, knows only that he followed what seemed to him the line of least resistance, and that every step in his course was preceded by another, and that there was a reason for what he did. Most likely he does not know the reason. In the hours of his despair he goes over his life in every detail, at every crossroad, and at all the forks where paths branch, always wishing he had gone the other way. While this is true, he could know neither the dangers that lurked along other roads, nor the fact that he had no choice about the way he went. All he knows is that he stumbled along a certain path which led to disaster. All the paths of life lead to tragedy. It is only a question as to how and when. With some, the evil day is longer delayed, and the disaster seems not so hard to bear. In a sense, all the classifications as to the cause of crime are misleading and worthless. Your existence is the result of infinite chances and causes, appalling in their number. Out of 1,000 eggs, one is fertilized by perhaps 1 of 1,000,000,000 sperms, and from this you have been given life. Each of your parents and grandparents and so on, back for 200,000 years of human ancestors, and back to infinity before man was born, was the result of the same seemingly blind and almost impossible hazard. The infinitely microscopic chance that each of us had for life cannot be approximated, All the drops of water in the ocean, or all the grains of sand upon the shore, or all the leaves on all the trees, if converted into numbers and used as a denominator, with 1 for a numerator, could hardly tell the fraction of a chance that gave us life. The causes of human action are infinite, and no cause stands isolated from the rest. In the first place, we cannot tell the meaning of the word cause when applied to a problem of this sort. In law, the ordinary rule for a proximate cause is an event or happening in the direct line of causation, not too remote, that has led to the result, and without which the result could not have happened. But this means nothing. Infinite are the causes which have led to every act, and without each one of the infinite causes the act could not have resulted. If it be something that affected a life, and had it not happened, then the life would have drifted somewhere else. In the end it would have reached the same harbour of Nirvana, but the life would not have been the same. A drop of water falls on the Rocky Mountains. It trickles along, going around through pebbles and grains of sand. It joins with others, meets trees and roots, winds and twists perhaps for hundreds, even thousands of miles, before one can tell by what channel it will reach the sea. Infinite accidents determine even which sea it shall finally reach. The most radical advocates of social control are never at a loss to lay their fingers on causes, or to know what would have happened if something else had not happened. They never hesitate to forbid seemingly innocent acts because they are certain that evil will follow. They are contemptuous of one who wants to preserve the semblance and spirit of freedom. Life has none too much to offer where men are left to control themselves, and to be forbidden to follow your inclinations and desires because sometimes they may result disastrously is to give up what seems to be a substance for what is most likely a shadow. All we can tell about the man whom we are pleased to call a criminal is that he had a poor equipment, and met certain influences, motives, and conditions, called environment, on his journey. We know that at a given time the journey has reached a certain point. It has met disaster or success, or most likely indifference. At a certain point he has reached a prison, or is waiting for the hangman to tie a noose around his neck. Is heredity responsible? We know of many who apparently started out with an equipment no better. These may be businessmen and congressmen and deacons in the church. While we do not know and cannot know the trend and relative strength of the instincts in the various machines, or the emotions that these and the whole equipment produced, apparently an equipment as poor as that of the criminal has met success, or at least kept its possessor out of jail. Was it then his environment? We have known men placed in the same environment, perhaps a brother, conquering difficulties and bringing success from what seemed to promise certain defeat. Why did one fail where the other conquered? Was it the will that caused one to be the captain of his soul? What then is the will, and who gave the weak will to one and the strong will to another? And if each was born with a certain will or the capacity to make a certain will, who then is responsible for the result? Or does the word will mean anything, as usually implied? All we can tell is that a certain equipment met a certain environment, and the result was early disaster. A change of even the slightest factor of environment might have saved the victim from hanging, so that he could die a respectable and peaceful death from tuberculosis or cancer. After all, the inevitable tragedy that in some form marks the end is not so important as the sensations and experiences that one meets on the road. Life is hopeless and colourless indeed if these experiences are chosen for the wayfarer, and the sensations are enforced or denied, as the case may be. Nothing recompenses the individual for the denial of his chance to follow his own path. Chapter 28. Industrialism and Crime. It was not until about the middle of the 18th century that the desire for the creation and accumulation of property began to rule the world. Up to that time, such small amounts of property as man needed or coveted had either been produced in a simple manner by himself, or taken in the easiest way. This new passion has made a large part of the modern criminal code. A world of warriors, religious zealots, and pastoral people could not readily adapt themselves to the change. Criminal codes were lengthened. Methods of getting property and keeping it were provided for, and other ways condemned. It must be obvious that it was not easy for man with his age-old machine, his inherited institutions, and his ancient folk ways, to adjust himself rapidly to the change. New conditions and laws created new criminals. With the growth of the factory system and accelerated industrial development, an overweening desire for material things was awakened. As neither individuals nor societies can be possessed of more than one overpowering emotion at a time, the devotion to property naturally weakened religious fervor. Religion became more an abstract belief and a social organization than a vital thing affecting life and conduct. Even before this time, there was growing up in the world a protest against the religious superstition that had led to the cruelties of the past. The scientist and the modern philosopher were making their contributions to the world of thought, and these contributions were slowly affecting life and conduct. A doubt of old creeds and doctrines and faiths was coming over the minds of men. Social conventions were loosening. New customs and habits were becoming folk ways. In short, society and life were growing more fluid and adaptable. The growth of property holdings created new desires and new temptations. The accumulation of large fortunes brought envy and hatred and ambition. The rise of industries built the large cities, with palaces on one hand and hovels on the other. The vast inequality of wealth and the growth of workers' organizations, together with the spirit of skepticism which activity always brings, caused large numbers to doubt the justice of property rights, the utility of many institutions, and the possibility of radical change by social organization. It is perfectly evident that all of this movement brought more conflict between social units, a constant lengthening of the criminal code to protect the interests of the controlling powers, an increase of prisons, and an apparent, if not a real, increase of crime. Nothing but a strong government can long endure great inequality of wealth or social condition. The slaves of the past civilization were kept in subjection by main strength and fear. This enslavement was aided by the deep ignorance of the masses, who had no means of information and nothing but vague feelings of the injustice of their lot. Even then the poor sometimes revolted, but such outbreaks were generally easily put down by the sword. The growth of political power and industrial independence has been accompanied by the constant conflict of social forces. This means conflict with the law, and the law has always taken its toll of victims. New inventions and methods that bring power of any sort carry with them social clashes, protests, bitterness, conflicts, and violations of law. The invention of gunpowder was the source of great conflict, and still continues to add to the inmates of prisons. From the first, the far-reaching effects of high explosives were seen by the wise, and firearms were permitted only in the hands of those who could be depended upon to support the state. Gradually, through the needs of the rulers in war, they were given to the poor. When the American Revolution separated us from Great Britain, the spirit of democracy and revolt was strong in the world. A body of peasants had gained independence over the strongest nation on earth. This body, through its delegates, provided in the Constitution of the United States that the people should never be forbidden to bear arms. The cheap production of firearms placed them in the hands of all who wished to buy. This aided feuds and brawls. It also gave strength to the burglar and robber. America was fast becoming a manufacturing and commercial nation. The accumulation of property was greater, and the inequalities, perhaps, more marked than in any other land. Likewise, the poor were more independent. Gradually, we came to rely more and more upon the power of law, and the force that goes with it to preserve the old order. Legislatures and city councils all over the United States began to limit and forbid carrying firearms. The Constitution of the United States was held no impediment to this legislation. Gradually, laws have forbidden the carrying of guns by the common man, and these laws are growing stronger every year. In many states, robbery with a gun may mean life imprisonment, while the mere carrying of a revolver is a serious offense. The passage of these drastic laws and the number of prison inmates confined for these offenses show that the invention and use of firearms has affected crime, and likewise that the government is constantly growing more doubtful of the common man. Civilization largely has to do with the creation and protection of property. Although it is related to literature, architecture, politics, art, and the like, even these things, if not actually rooted in property, are stimulated or affected by property. Civilization has created new crimes and new ways to commit crime. It has likewise created many wants and desires that furnish the motive power of property crimes. Each new invention of civilization adds to these needs and these desires, increases the power of committing crime, and necessitates stricter measures to prevent it. Civilization has likewise created many new outlets for the emotions, strengthened old ones, weakened others, and added to the complexity of life. It has imposed added strain and stress upon man's nervous system, and through this has caused the abnormalities and excesses that are either crimes or lead to crimes. Civilization has created the big cities. In other words, the powers and forces that made civilization have made the big cities. The invention and development of the railroad has taken men from the air and sunlight and comparative freedom of motion of the country and the small village, and placed them in an atmosphere not really fitted for normal animal life, especially the life of the young. It has likewise stimulated crime by offering the opportunities and making the suggestions that are potent factors in crime. In country and village life, everyone was known. The smallest detail of every life was an open book. This fact furnished a moral restraint to the individual, and likewise made it hard for him to violate the rules of the game. The opportunities for collecting large numbers of people who might encourage each other with their conversation and association were very few in rural life. The man who would violate the law must do it alone. Not only this, but he must take his first steps almost without suggestion or aid. This confined criminal conduct largely to the feeble-minded and the seriously defective, and even these could generally live in a country atmosphere where life is simple and easy, without serious danger to themselves or others. The great city, with its swarms of people, its wealth and poverty, its unhealthy atmosphere, its opportunities for everyone to have many associates and still be lost to the community at large, makes irregular lives not only easy but almost necessary to large numbers of men. Civilization has no doubt created crime, as it has created luxury, wealth, refinement, and ease. Much luxury has always led to deterioration and decay, and is doubtless leading that way now. One of the latest products of civilization that has had a marked effect on crime is the automobile. Stringent laws are on the statute books of all states against stealing automobiles, yet stealing and selling automobiles is a flourishing and growing business. A large percentage of the boys in the juvenile courts of our cities are there for stealing automobiles. Yet this is the work of a very short period. I do not mean to say that many of the boys brought into court for stealing automobiles would not have committed some other crime, if automobiles had not been invented and come into general use, but I feel quite sure that many of them are victims of the automobile madness alone. The automobile is one of the latest manias and fashions that civilization has provided. Almost no one is free from the disease. Conservative businessmen must have motor cars. Clerks and salaried people who cannot afford them must get them. Mechanics and professional men who have no need for them except that others use them must contrive to buy them. Automobiles are much more important today than houses. Men go into debt and struggle for money to buy gasoline, so that they may drive somewhere for the sake of coming back. It has created a psychology all its own, a psychology of movement, of impatience, of waste, of futility. Men in Chicago start to drive to Milwaukee without the slightest reason for going there. They travel the road so fast that they could get no idea of the scenery, even if there were something to see. They hurry as if going for a doctor. They reach their destination and then start back home. The specific desire that is satisfied by this expense and waste is a new one, an emotion of no value in the life processes, and probably of great injury in life development. It is a craze for movement, for haste, for what seems like change. The automobile has made its list of criminals, and it is making them every day. Probably it will continue to make them until the flying machine is perfected, and then, to some extent at least, the airplane will take its place. The truth is that man is not adapted to the automobile. His reactions are too simple. His inherent needs are not adjusted to the new life. He has not been built up with barriers to protect him from this insidious temptation which is claiming its victims by the hundreds every day. The boy is perfectly helpless in the presence of this lure. He wants to do what others do. He is by nature active and venturesome, and needs to keep on the move. The mechanism itself appeals to him. He wants to work in a garage. He is anxious to be a chauffeur. He cannot resist an automobile. No such temptation should be placed before a boy. It has added a great deal to the responsibility of parents and teachers, and so far they seem not to have been able to meet that responsibility in any way. Aside from the boy's thefts, it has played a great part in crime. The doctor, the real estate agent, the businessman cannot afford to be without automobiles. No more can the burglar, the hold-up man, the bank robber, if he would keep up to date. The automobile has raised the robbery of country banks from a vagrant crime, infrequent and dangerous, to a steady occupation, coupled with a great deal of excitement and some chance for profit. So far, no one has ever suggested anything to counteract or lessen the evil effects, except to increase penalties. The crimes committed with and for automobiles are a result of the conditions of life. Out of 1,000 men and boys, a certain percentage must commit these crimes, just as a certain percentage must die of tuberculosis. The temptation is very great. The human equipment is not strong enough in many people to withstand the temptation. They either buy them when they cannot afford to own them, or they steal them, and either way leads to disaster. No doubt men will sometime become adjusted to the automobile. as they have become adjusted to the horse. But until that time comes, it will demand its heavy toll of unfortunates. Not only, it seems to me, does the growth of civilization mean the growth of crime, but that civilization likewise leads to decay. The world has seen the result over and over again, but it cannot learn. Man is an animal. The law of his being demands that he shall live close to nature. He needs the outdoors, the country, the air. He needs to walk and run. Otherwise, his digestive apparatus will fail, his brain power will decay, and the strength of his legs will be impaired. Civilization runs too much to stomach and nerves, and nature will have revenge. To be sure, the professional American rhapsodist points out that we are immune from natural law because we have a chance to vote for presidents once in every 4 years. But there are ample signs that nature knows little about political institutions or other man-made devices, and that she will have her way. How much the natural limitations of man will permit him to learn and understand, how far his instincts and emotional nature would allow him to be controlled by knowledge, if he had it, what would be the results to life if reason could control him, are pertinent questions that affect all discussion and which may never be satisfactorily answered. It is entirely possible that the student who tries to point out better ways and teach better methods does it only to satisfy his own emotions, and is often conscious that it does nothing else. But whatever the inducing cause or result, given a brain and nervous system and the material that civilization furnishes for reflection, these and other important subjects will be interesting topics of study and furnish material for the reflective powers of man. Chapter 29. War and Crime. All natural phenomena affect the activities of man. It has been repeatedly observed that the number of crimes of assault and murder increases in the summer months and fluctuates with extreme heat or a cooler temperature. The nervous system of man is responsive to all sorts of physical and psychological influences, and criminologists take these into account in considering crime, as doctors take them into account in treating disease. Man is influenced by substantially all the things that affect other structures, and by many things that do not. His nervous system is more delicate, his emotional nature more complex, and his brain permits the handling of impressions in a way not possible to lower organisms. The effect of war has always been manifest in human conduct. Man acts largely from habit and custom. He does as others do, without reflection as to why he should do it, or why others do it. War is a sudden, violent, and spectacular destroyer of all established habits. In its conduct and preparation it has rules of its own which have no analogy in civil life. The battlefield is a reversion to the primitive, a reversion which man finds it easy to make, for it appeals to fundamental instincts which civilization holds in leash with great difficulty and never with entire success. War especially appeals to the young. Their desire for activity, their impatience with restraint, their love of the spectacular, their untrained emotions, all find a ready outlet in war. Even those who are too young to fight still read of it, talk of it, play at it, to the exclusion of other games. War is a profound and rapid maker of mental attitudes and of complexes that are quick to develop and slow to pass away. Both the quick development and slow decay are probably due to the fact that war meets a decided response in the primitive nature of man. Nearly all the newspapers of America are now calling attention to the increase of crime since the close of the Great War. It is a topic of pulpit and platform discussion. Wild appeals are made for convictions and extreme penalties. Governors and boards of pardon and parole are urged to refuse clemency to prisoners and are roundly condemned when they do their plain duty, even though they do it very reluctantly and tardily. It is probably true that the close of the war has shown a large increase in criminality, especially in crimes of violence. This is true not only of America, but of all European countries. In some of the most afflicted ones, civil government for a time has virtually broken down. Both the great need for food and clothing and the overthrowing of conventions, customs, and habits are responsible for the change. Here we perceive a notable example of the almost instantaneous disruption of established folkways. For more than 4 years, most of the Western world did nothing but kill. The whole world talked of slaughter, and devoted its energy to killing. Every sentiment of humanity was forgotten. Even religious ties and religious commands were ignored. The prayers to the Almighty contained requests that He help the various fighting nations to kill their enemies. Everyone was taught to hate. The leaders in the war knew that boys could not do efficient killing unless they learned to fear and hate. The most outrageous falsehoods were freely circulated by every nation about its enemies and their conduct of the war. The highest rewards were offered for new and more efficient ways to kill. Every school was turned over to hate and preparation for war, and, of course, all the churches joined in the universal craze. God would not only forgive killing, but reward those who were the most expert at the game. The newspapers carried stories of battles every day, the dead and wounded often running into the tens of thousands. None of the reports was exact. Nothing was true. Everything was wild and exaggerated. Facts were not strong enough to make an impression. Lies were deliberately circulated to help the cause. Every tradition and habit of life was broken, and broken all the time. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was repealed. Property was not only ruthlessly destroyed, but openly confiscated. Lying was a fine art. When this bears a harvest after the war, the public loudly clamors for hanging boys whose psychology is a direct result of long and intensive training by the leaders of the world. One life is not worth considering in the face of the Holocaust that has taken its hundreds of thousands and has been defended in the schools and churches. It is not strange that the after-war harvest of crimes should come largely from boys, often those boys who did their part on the field of battle. Whether they got the psychology from killing, or reading, or hearing, or playing soldier, or training, makes no difference. Everyone who has any reasoning power knows that they got it, that it was deliberately given to them, if not forced upon them, and that just as deliberately the state is killing them because they took it. It is not alone the young who show this psychology of killing that has grown out of the war. Organized society, the public, juries, judges, pardon boards and governors show that war has made them cruel and wanton of human life. The great number of hangings since the war is patent to all observers. In normal times, juries were very loath to pronounce the death penalty. With any possible excuse, they always saved life. Now they pride themselves on taking life. Even insanity does not always prevent an execution. Numerous are the evidences of the derangements the war has created and left behind. A few years ago, a prize fight would not have been permitted in more than 1 or 2 states in the Union. Now, state after state is passing laws to permit prize fights to take place, and even the best society has given its sanction to this sort of sport. Whether the state should permit prize fights is not the question. The fact is, as everyone knows, that it is permitted on account of a psychology growing out of the war. we content ourselves with saying it will never do to raise our boys as mollycoddles. They must learn to fight. It is not alone murder that can be traced directly to the war psychology. Robbery and burglary have rapidly increased, and much of this is due to the emotions of boys. The robbing of country banks has grown to be almost a pastime, and often one or more participants in these raids is a returned soldier. What should be done to meet these new conditions? Common honesty, common sense, and common humanity alike plainly show that a large part of the crimes of violence are due to the war. Will hangings and life sentences stop them? And if so, is it right for organized society to ignore its responsibility and place it on the young men that they inoculated with the universal madness? It is expecting too much to think that there is any process by which society can be made to think and feel. Some day, however, when the war fever passes away, crime will again take its normal place. This phenomenon is not new in the world. Everyone interested has noted it before. It has followed all great wars. War means the breaking up of old habits, the destruction of many inhibitions, which in the strongest civilization are only skin deep at the best. It means the return to the primitive feelings that once ruled man. The Napoleonic Wars left a long heritage of crime. Every nation in Europe was affected by them. Many years passed before the world grew tranquil. Our Civil War brought its harvest of crime. It was felt both north and south. It was not confined to homicide, but was shown in all sorts of criminal statistics, especially crimes of violence. I do not write as a pacifist. There is nothing in the constitution of man that makes pacifism anything but a dream. Man is largely ruled by fear and hate, and it is not possible to imagine an individual or a race that, under sufficient provocation, will not fight. Neither is it possible that nations will not always, from time to time, find the provocation sufficiently great. Individuals and nations can philosophize and reason and make compromises when they are calm, but let them be moved by fear and hatred, and these emotions will sweep away every other feeling. The conditions for war were ripe in 1914, and it was inevitable that America should be in it too. This should not make one wish for war, nor believe in war, nor close one's eyes to its horrors and results. Much less should it prevent him from trying to do his part to restore sanity to the world. Another consequence of war which America is passing through is the spirit of super-patriotism. This is always aroused, and must be aroused, to carry on the war. It is potent in creating the psychology that makes men fight. Every people teaches that its own country is the best, that its laws and institutions excel those of all other lands. This spirit is taken advantage of and used by designing men. It is used to send to jail those who criticize existing things. It is used to hamper and destroy any effort to change laws and institutions. The one who criticizes conditions is a disturber and a traitor. Those who profit by existing things are always intense patriots, and by means of cheap appeals and trite expressions seek to stifle discussion and criticism. This war has borne a deadly harvest of restrictive legislation in America. We are no longer an asylum for political offenders. We no longer stand for freedom of speech. Old traditions and constitutional and legal guarantees have been swept aside under the hysteria which has prevailed during and since the war. These results were inevitable and will follow war as long as man is man. All the after effects of the World War show how completely man is ruled by forces over which he has no control. If considerable numbers of the people have been moved by war hysteria, and if a large part of crime is directly traceable to war, it seems plain that all human action could be traced to some controlling cause, if only man could be wise enough and industrious and humane enough to find the cause. It is plain that the law of cause and effect influences mental phenomena as it does physical acts, and sometime, perhaps, men will seek to avoid the effect by removing the cause. Chapter 30. Civilization and Crime. As children, we have all amused ourselves by looking into a kaleidoscope, turning it around and watching the changing patterns formed from the mixing bits of different colored glass in the other end. Each turn makes a different pattern, and each bit of glass seems to seek a spot in the general medley where it can be settled, until another turn drives it to find a resting place somewhere else. The organization of individual units into a group is more or less such a formation, each seeking to adjust itself to a pattern and finding that the pattern is ever changing, and the individual units obliged to seek new positions and make new adjustments. It is vain for social theorists to talk of a perfect order, a system of social organization that will find the proper place for each unit and bring social symmetry out of the whole. Such a society is not consistent with the varied capacities and wants of men. Neither is a perfect order possible with ever-changing and moving physical forces, with new mental perceptions, with new needs and wants, with constant births and deaths, and with the innate instincts of man. Some system may be the best for a time, but must in turn give place to new formations. In this process the old is ever mixed with the new. The past hangs on to plague the present, and the vision of the future disturbs the quiet and stability that the present inherited from the past. Organizations of society are necessary and automatic. The frost on the window pane takes its pattern. The crystals in the glass and stone have their formations. The grain of sand, the plant, all forms of animal life, the solar system, and doubtless an infinite number of other systems which the eye cannot see or the mind comprehend, take on form and order. The symmetry and shape of any of these organizations may be shattered by growth or catastrophe, and new forms may take their place. All life is constant friction and constant adjustment, each particle in a blind way trying to find a more harmonious relation, but never reaching complete rest. The social and political patterns that men have taken have been of many forms. All through the past these have changed, and the laws and habits that were meant to hold men together have been made and discarded as fast as new emotions or ideas have gained the power to make the change. Men are of all degrees of adaptability. Some can readily conform to the new, some adjust themselves very slowly. Man's structure is fixed. His inherent instincts are of ancient origin, always urging him to primitive reactions. His habits are slowly formed and slowly changed. Slowly he settles himself to the conditions that surround him. He learns their demands. He manages to conform. But the folk ways that he knew and the way of life he learned must be changed to something else. Every new adjustment, every change of organization, every modification made by civilization bears its toll of victims who have not been able to adjust themselves to the new order. The first criminal regulations doubtless had to do with the personal relations of men. The number of offenses was small, for life was simple, wants were few, and ambition rare. The growth of religion created a ferocious criminal code, regulating every thought and action that God's agents thought might offend the deity or threaten their power on earth. Anyone interested in the story of punishment for heresy, sorcery, or other crimes growing out of religious fanaticism can read the story in Lecky's History of Rationalism in Europe, in White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, in Draper's Intellectual Development of Europe, and in many other books. The Spanish Inquisition alone furnished about 350,000 victims in the 2 centuries of its power. Many of them were burned alive, many others were killed by the most cruel torture that could be devised by man. Up to recent times, more victims have been put to death for heresy and kindred crimes against religion than for any other cause. Next to this, no doubt, stand political crimes. Even America hanged old women for witchcraft, a crime they could not commit. Practically all the victims of religious and political persecution have been guiltless of any real crimes, and among them were always many of the noblest of their age. Every general change of religious or political ideas bears its quota of crimes. For whatever the religious or political organization, it always uses every means in its power to perpetuate itself. This is as true of republics as of monarchies, although the severity of punishment and the amount of heresy permitted change from time to time. Each age is sure that it has the true religion and the God-given political organization. In every age the accepted religion is true, and the king and the state can do no wrong. One thing only seems to be sure: human nature does not change. Whether it was the theological systems of the ancient world fighting to keep Christianity out, or Christianity fighting to preserve itself, the same cruel, bigoted, fanatical majority has been found to do its will, and the same reasons and excuses have served the law from the earliest times down to today. A letter of the younger Pliny, who was then governor of Bithynia Pontus, a province of Rome, asking the Emperor Trajan for instructions in dealing with the early Christians, shows how persistent are intolerance and bigotry. This might have been written yesterday. To seek advance in the suppression of opinion and punishment for sedition in any of the most advanced governments of the modern world, as it was in the most advanced of the ancient world. The letter is here reproduced as an interesting exhibit of human nature and its fixity. Pliny the Younger was born in 61 AD and became governor of the province of Bithynia Pontus about the year 112 AD, under the Emperor Trajan. In the discharge of his duties as governor, Pliny discovered that the conversion of many of his subjects to Christianity had resulted in a falling off of trade in the victims usually purchased for sacrifices at the temples, and in other commodities used in connection with pagan worship. As a good governor, Pliny sought to remedy this economic situation, and his plan was to restore his subjects to their old forms of worship. Thus he was brought into contact with Christianity. The following letters, one from Pliny to Trajan and the other Trajan's reply, show the situation. These documents are from the 10th book of Pliny's correspondence, letters 97 and 98. Pliny asking instructions of Trajan on trials of Christians. It is my invariable rule, sir, to refer to you in all matters where I feel doubtful. For who is more capable of removing my scruples or informing my ignorance? Having never been present at any trials concerning those who profess Christianity, I am unacquainted not only with the nature of their crimes or the measure of their punishment, but how far it is proper to enter into an examination concerning them. Whether, therefore, any difference is usually made with respect to ages, or no distinction is to be observed between the young and the adult. Whether repentance entitles them to a pardon, or if a man has been once a Christian, it avails nothing to desist from his error. Whether the very profession of Christianity, unattended with any criminal act, or only the crimes themselves inherent in the profession, are punishable. On all these points I am in great doubt. In the meanwhile, the method I have observed towards those who have been brought before me as Christians is this. I asked them whether they were Christians. If they admitted it, I repeated the question twice, and threatened them with punishment. If they persisted, I ordered them to be at once punished, for I was persuaded, whatever the nature of their opinions might be, a contumacious and inflexible obstinacy certainly deserved correction. There were others also brought before me as possessed with the same infatuation, but, being Roman citizens, I directed them to be sent to Rome. But this crime spreading, as is usually the case, while it was actually under prosecution, several instances of the same nature occurred. An anonymous information was laid before me, containing a charge against several persons who, upon examination, denied they were Christians, or had ever been so. They repeated after me an invocation to the gods, and offered religious rites with wine and incense before your statue, which for that purpose I had ordered to be brought, together with those of the gods, and even reviled the name of Christ. Whereas there is no forcing, it is said, those who are really Christians into any of these compliances. I thought it proper, therefore, to discharge them. Some among those who were accused by a witness in person at first confessed themselves Christians, but immediately after denied it. The rest owned indeed that they had been of that number formerly, but had now, some above 3, others more, and a few above 20 years ago, renounced that error. They all worshipped your statue and the images of the gods, uttering imprecations at the same time against the name of Christ. They affirmed the whole of their guilt or their error was that they met on a stated day before it was light, and addressed a form of prayer to Christ as to a divinity, binding themselves by a solemn oath, not for the purpose of any wicked design, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to eat in common a harmless meal. From this custom, however, they desisted after the publication of my edict, by which, according to your commands, I forbade the meeting of any assemblies. After receiving this account, I judged it so much the more necessary to endeavour to extort the real truth, by putting 2 female slaves to the torture, who were said to officiate in their religious rites. But all I could discover was evidence of an absurd and extravagant superstition. I deemed it expedient, therefore, to adjourn all further proceedings in order to consult you, for it appears to be a matter highly deserving your consideration, more especially as great numbers must be involved in the danger of these prosecutions, which have already extended and are still likely to extend to persons of all ranks and ages, and even of both sexes. In fact, this contagious superstition is not confined to the cities only, but has spread its infection among the neighbouring villages and country. Nevertheless, it still seems possible to restrain its progress. The temples, at least, which were once almost deserted, begin now to be frequented, and the sacred rites, after a long intermission, are again revived, while there is a general demand for the victims, which till lately found very few purchasers. From all this it is easy to conjecture what numbers might be reclaimed if a general pardon were granted to those who shall repent of their error. Trajan to Pliny. You have adopted a right course, my dearest Secundus, in investigating the charges against the Christians who were brought before you. It is not possible to lay down any general rule for all such cases. Do not go out of your way to look for them. If, indeed, they should be brought before you, and the crime is proved, they must be punished, with the restriction, however, that where the party denies he is a Christian, and shall make it evident that he is not, by invoking our gods, let him, notwithstanding any former suspicion, be pardoned upon his repentance. Anonymous information ought not to be received in any sort of prosecution. It is introducing a very dangerous precedent, and is quite foreign to the spirit of our age. Civilization is largely a question of new machinery and methods. It is not the humanizing of men. It is plain that no matter what the time or age, the characteristics of man remain the same. His structure does not change. His emotional life cannot change. New objects and desires may control his feeling, but whatever the aim of the age and place, the same inherent emotions control. Intolerance has been one of the great sources of evil all down the ages. It is practically certain that neither time nor education has made man more kindly in his judgment of his fellows, or more tolerant in his opinions and life. All that education can do is to remove some of the inducing causes that have always brought the sharp conflicts and awakened the cruelty of man. Every civilization brings new evils and new complexities, which man meets with the same machine and the same emotions. It is fairly certain that no nobler idealism or no finer feelings have been planted or cultivated in man since the dawn of history, and when it is thoroughly realized that man's structure is fixed and cannot be changed, it seems as if none could be developed.